Welcome back to Drowsy History. Tonight, we're going to spend some slow, quiet hours with the most famous woman of the ancient world. And almost everything you think you know about her is wrong. Before we begin, if these long nights of history help you drift off, consider subscribing so you never lose your place here. And down in the comments, tell me the oldest story your family still tells. And if nothing comes to mind, just let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now settle in, let your shoulders sink, and let's travel back more than 2,000 years to a city of white stone at the edge of the sea. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Cleopatra. Chances are you see something very specific: heavy black eyeliner, a golden headdress, a beautiful seductress draped across a couch, feeding on the attention of powerful men. Perhaps you see Elizabeth Taylor in Technicolor, or a painting of a dying queen with a snake at her arm. Perhaps you see luxury, appetite, and ruin. Here's the strange truth we'll be unwinding tonight. That picture was designed. It was built deliberately and skillfully by the people who defeated her. It is one of the oldest and most successful smear campaigns in human history, and it has now outlived its creators by 2,000 years. The real Cleopatra, the seventh queen of her name, the last ruler of an ancient kingdom, was something far more interesting than a seductress. She was a scholar who spoke perhaps 9 languages, in an age when kings rarely bothered to learn even one beyond their own. She was an economist who steered her country through drought and famine while Rome circled overhead. She was a mother, a naval strategist, a builder of fleets, a negotiator who kept the most powerful empire on earth at arm's length for over 2 decades, using nothing but wit, wealth, and nerve. She was also, we should say plainly, not perfect. She lived inside a brutal dynasty and played by its brutal rules. We won't hide that tonight, but we will let her be a full human being, which is more than her enemies ever allowed her. And here is the first surprise, the one that startles almost everyone. Cleopatra, the most famous Egyptian who ever lived, was not by blood Egyptian at all. Her family came from Macedonia in the mountainous north of Greece. For nearly 300 years before her birth, her ancestors had ruled Egypt while remaining stubbornly, almost comically Greek. Greek names, Greek language, Greek habits, generation after generation, in a palace by the sea that faced toward Europe. Cleopatra was the one who turned around and faced Egypt. She was, as far as we know, the first ruler in her entire dynasty who ever bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Think about that. Nearly 3 centuries of kings and queens ruling millions of Egyptian people, and not one of them, until her, could speak to those people in their own tongue. That single fact tells you more about who she really was than any painting of a woman with a snake. So tonight, we're going to walk through her whole life, slowly, the way we always do. We'll see the dangerous palace she grew up in, where family members were as likely to bury one another as to embrace. We'll see the greatest library on earth, which was practically her backyard. We'll watch her lose her throne as a teenager and win it back before she was 22. We'll meet the 2 Romans whose names became forever tangled with hers, and we'll try to see those famous romances the way she may have seen them, not as love stories first, but as statecraft. And at the end, when the story turns dark, as we know it must, we'll handle it the way we always handle sorrow on this channel, gently, honestly, and without lingering where we shouldn't. By the time you drift off tonight, and it's perfectly fine if you do, I hope you'll have met someone new, not the queen of the propaganda posters, the real one, the woman Rome was so afraid of that they spent 2,000 years telling us she was only a pretty face. Let's begin where she began, in the most extraordinary city in the ancient world. Imagine you are standing in Alexandria on an evening in the year 60 BCE, when Cleopatra is a girl of about 9 years old, somewhere behind the high walls of the palace quarter. The first thing you notice is the light. It's late in the day, and the sun is sliding down toward the sea, turning the water of the harbor a deep hammered gold. Alexandria sits on a narrow ribbon of land between the Mediterranean and a broad lake. So wherever you stand in this city, you are never far from water, and the air always tastes faintly of salt. The second thing you notice is that this city is enormous. Perhaps 500,000 people live here. Some scholars think more. In the entire world, only Rome rivals it, and many travelers would tell you Rome is the uglier of the two. Alexandria was not a city that grew slowly out of a village, street by crooked street. It was designed all at once on a grid by order of Alexander the Great himself, nearly 3 centuries before this evening. Its main avenue, the Canopic Way, runs dead straight across the city, wide enough for 8 chariots abreast, lined with colonnades of white limestone that seem to glow even now at dusk. Walk along it with me, slowly. You pass Greek merchants closing up shop, arguing cheerfully in the quick, clipped Greek of the marketplace. You pass Egyptian laborers heading home along the canal, calling to each other in a language the palace above them has never learned. You pass Jewish scholars. Alexandria holds one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. And Syrians, Nubians, Arabs, traders from India who came up the Red Sea with pepper and pearls. Half the languages of the known world are being spoken within a mile of where you stand. Somewhere ahead of you, past the theater, past the temple district, rises the palace quarter. Not one palace, but a whole city within a city of courtyards, gardens, harbors, and halls, occupying as much as a quarter of Alexandria. Each Ptolemy who ruled here added a wing, a garden, a shrine, until the royal compound became a kind of marble labyrinth. Somewhere inside it this evening is a 9-year-old girl with her tutors, and no particular expectation that she will ever rule anything. Now look north, out past the harbor. There, on its little island, joined to the city by a long stone causeway, stands the thing every visitor comes to see, the Pharos, the great lighthouse, one of the wonders of the world. It climbs perhaps 400 feet into the evening sky in 3 great tiers of pale stone, square, then octagonal, then round, and at its crown a fire burns all night, thrown out to sea by polished bronze mirrors. Sailors say you can see it from 30 miles away. For ships feeling their way along this flat, treacherous coastline, that light is the difference between a safe harbor and a hull torn open on the shoals. It is hard not to read the lighthouse as a message. Egypt is old, unimaginably old, even by the standards of this evening. The pyramids are already more ancient to Cleopatra than Cleopatra is to us. But Alexandria is new, and Greek, and loud, and rich, and it wants the whole Mediterranean to see it shining. And there is one more building we have to visit before the light fails, because no building on earth will matter more to the girl in the palace. Near the royal quarter stands the museum, the Shrine of the Muses, and attached to it, the Library of Alexandria. This is not a quiet reading room. It is the largest research institution the ancient world has ever built. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls and generations of salaried scholars who live here at the crown's expense, doing nothing but studying. In these halls, a man named Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth and came astonishingly close. Here, astronomers charted the stars, physicians mapped the body, and poets edited Homer into the versions we still read. The Ptolemies collected books the way other kings collected gold. Ships entering the harbor were searched, not for weapons, but for scrolls, which were seized and copied for the collection. Knowledge in this city was treated as treasure. This is the air Cleopatra grew up breathing. Before we ever talk about Rome, or generals, or the famous romances, hold on to this picture. A girl raised a short walk from the greatest library on earth, in a city where a dozen languages tangled in every market, under a lighthouse whose whole purpose was to be seen. She would spend her entire life trying to keep that light burning. To understand Cleopatra, you have to understand the strange family she was born into, because the Ptolemies were one of the most remarkable and most troubled dynasties in all of history. The story begins almost 300 years before her birth with Alexander the Great. When Alexander swept into Egypt in 332 BCE, the Egyptians largely welcomed him. He had, after all, just relieved them of their Persian occupiers. He founded Alexandria, had himself recognized in the traditional manner of pharaohs, and then marched off to conquer the rest of the known world. He never saw his city completed. Within a decade, he was dead in Babylon, not yet 33 years old, leaving behind the largest empire on earth and no clear heir. What followed was a feeding frenzy. Alexander's generals carved up his empire like men dividing an inheritance while the body was still warm, and the shrewdest of them all was a Macedonian officer named Ptolemy. While the other generals fought each other for decades over the grand prize of Alexander's whole empire, Ptolemy quietly took Egypt, wealthy, defensible, bounded by deserts and sea, and simply held it. He even managed to steal Alexander's body itself as it was being carried home for burial, diverting the funeral procession to Egypt. The founder of the world's most famous city was laid to rest in Alexandria, in a tomb that became the dynasty's greatest relic. It was a masterstroke of public relations. Whoever kept Alexander kept his legend. Ptolemy crowned himself king, and his descendants ruled Egypt for the next 275 years. Every single male ruler in the line was named Ptolemy. The royal women drew from a small pool of names as well: Berenice, Arsinoe, and again, Cleopatra, a fine old Macedonian name that means roughly, glory of her father. The girl we're following tonight was the seventh royal Cleopatra. That's why historians call her Cleopatra the Seventh, though to be fair to her, she needed no number. She's the only one the world remembers. Now here is where the family history takes its strange turn, and we should talk about it honestly, because it shaped everything. The Ptolemies, following a practice with deep roots in Egyptian royal tradition, frequently married within their own family. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces. The official theology presented the royal couple as divine pairs, like the gods Isis and Osiris, and the practice kept power, wealth, and legitimacy locked inside a single bloodline. To the Greek world, it was scandalous. Inside the palace at Alexandria, it was simply how things were done. The result, over 10 generations, was a family tree that folded in on itself again and again, and a dynasty that combined genuine brilliance with genuine dysfunction. Because when your sibling is also your co ruler, your spouse, and your rival for the throne, family life becomes politics, and politics in the ancient world could be lethal. Ptolemaic history is littered with siblings who went to war with each other, mothers and sons who could not share a throne, and rulers who did not die of old age. Cleopatra was born into the very end of this line in 69 BCE, and she inherited both sides of the family character: the sharp, curious, calculating intelligence, and the willingness to treat her own siblings as opponents in a game with no second place. We will see both tonight. But hold on to the central point, because it's the myth bust at the heart of her whole story. For nearly 3 centuries, this Macedonian Greek family ruled Egypt from their Greek city, in their Greek language, celebrating Greek festivals, while the great mass of Egyptians, the farmers along the Nile, the priests in the old temples of Memphis and Thebes, lived in what was almost a separate country. The Ptolemies took Egyptian throne names and posed for temple carvings in the old pharaonic style because it was politically useful, but they did not become Egyptian. A peasant in the Delta and a king in Alexandria could live out their entire lives without sharing a single word of common language. Until her. Cleopatra learned Egyptian. She embraced the old religion in a way her ancestors never had, presenting herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the Great Mother, the throne of Egypt itself. She celebrated rituals on the Nile that no Ptolemy had bothered with in living memory, whether this was faith, strategy, or both at once, and with Cleopatra, the honest answer is usually both at once. It made her something new, the first ruler in 300 years who tried to belong to the country she governed. Rome would later paint her as an alien, the Egyptian woman, as if it were an insult. There's a quiet irony there. Her whole family had spent centuries refusing to be Egyptian. She was the first one who said yes. Cleopatra's father was King Ptolemy XII, and history has not been kind to him. His subjects nicknamed him Auletes, the flute player, because of his enthusiasm for performing music at palace festivals, and the nickname was not entirely affectionate. To the proud Alexandrians, a king who played the pipes like a hired entertainer was a king who had misplaced his dignity. But Auletes had a bigger problem than his reputation, and it was the problem that would define his daughter's entire life: Rome. By the time Cleopatra was born, the Mediterranean had changed beyond recognition. The old Greek kingdoms that once balanced each other, Macedonia, Syria, Pergamon, had fallen to Rome one by one, swallowed into provinces. Egypt was the last great independent kingdom left standing, and everyone knew why it was still standing. Not because Rome couldn't take it, but because Rome hadn't decided to yet. Egypt was simply too rich. Its Nile harvests fed cities across the sea. Its treasury was legendary, and that wealth, made Roman politicians circle it like a prize each was afraid to let a rival claim. More than once, voices in Rome proposed simply annexing Egypt outright. So Aulitz made a decision that was either cowardly or clear eyed, depending on where you stood. He decided that if Egypt could not fight Rome, Egypt would buy Rome. He borrowed staggering sums from Roman financiers and poured them into bribes, payments to Rome's most powerful men in exchange for recognition of his throne. At one point, he pledged 6,000 talents, something close to Egypt's entire annual revenue, to Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great for a formal declaration that he was a friend and ally of the Roman people. Imagine paying a year of your country's income just to be officially tolerated. The Alexandrians hated it. They hated the taxes that funded the bribes, hated the humiliation, hated watching their king kneel to foreigners. And in 58 BCE, when Rome seized the Ptolemaic territory of Cyprus and Aulitz said nothing, the city finally boiled over. The Alexandrian mob, famous throughout the ancient world for making and unmaking kings, drove Aulitz out of Egypt entirely. Cleopatra was about 11 years old. Some historians believe she traveled with her exiled father to Rhodes, to Athens, perhaps to Rome itself, watching him plead his case in marble villas, a king reduced to a beggar with excellent manners. We can't be certain she was there, but someone in that family was taking notes on how power actually worked, because the lessons of those years are written all over her later life. Lesson 1: Rome was not one thing. It was a set of ambitious, competing men, and those men could be dealt with individually, flattered, financed, played against each other. Lesson 2: Money was a weapon, and Egypt had more of it than anyone. And lesson 3, the darkest one, came from what happened back home. In her father's absence, the throne passed to his eldest daughter, Cleopatra's older sister, Berenice. When Aulitz finally clawed his way back to power in 55 BCE, restored by Roman soldiers, his restoration purchased with yet more borrowed money, he had Berenice executed, his own daughter. Cleopatra was around 14 years old when her sister was put to death for the crime of wearing the crown. Let that settle for a moment, gently. Whatever else we say about Cleopatra tonight, her brilliance, her charm, her ruthlessness, remember that she learned the rules of her world at 14, watching her father kill her sister over the throne. In this family, there was no such thing as a harmless rival. Losing a power struggle didn't mean retirement. The palace she grew up in was beautiful: sea light on marble, gardens, music, the finest tutors on earth. And it was also a place where love and danger wore the same face. One more figure from these years deserves a mention because the ancient world was small and its threads cross in strange ways. Among the Roman officers who escorted Aulitz back to Egypt in 55 BCE was a young cavalry commander in his 20s, charming, broad-shouldered, popular with his men. His name was Mark Antony. Ancient writers, who loved a good foreshadowing, claimed he glimpsed the teenage princess during that campaign and never quite forgot her. That may be a storyteller's flourish, but it is true that he was there, in Alexandria, when she was 14, one of the armored foreigners propping up her family's throne. 14 years later, She would sail to meet him on a golden barge, and their two names would be bound together for the rest of history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, the flute player has to die and leave his kingdom to a teenager. Before we put the crown on her head, let's spend a few quiet minutes on the part of Cleopatra that the movies always leave out, which is strange because it may be the most impressive thing about her. Cleopatra was, by the standards of any age, phenomenally educated. She was raised in the Greek intellectual tradition at its absolute peak, in the city that housed the library and the museum, and the royal children of Alexandria were tutored by scholars drawn from that world, men who spent their lives on rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy. Her curriculum would have run through Homer and the tragedians, through geometry and music theory, through the art of public speaking, which the Greeks regarded as the crown of all education. A ruler who could not speak beautifully, they believed, could not rule at all. She could speak beautifully. Even her enemies admitted that. The Greek biographer Plutarch, writing about a century and a half after her death, and drawing, he tells us, on accounts from people whose grandparents had actually known her court, left us the single most valuable description of Cleopatra we have. And what did he emphasize? Not her face, her conversation, and above all, her voice. He describes it as an instrument of many strings, something she could tune to any listener. Talking with her, he says, had a kind of sting or spark. The Greek word suggests delight, charm, and irresistible quality. People walked away from conversations with Cleopatra feeling that they were more interesting than they had realized. That is a rare and dangerous talent. And then there were the languages. Plutarch reports that she rarely needed an interpreter, and he rattles off the peoples she could address directly: Ethiopians, troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, Parthians, and others besides, he adds, as if the list were getting tedious. Modern historians count perhaps 9 languages, with the exact list open to debate. But even the cautious version is astonishing. This was a working diplomatic skill set. She could negotiate with a Nubian envoy, an Arab merchant prince, a Judean king, or a Parthian ambassador, each in his own tongue, with no interpreter standing between them to soften, distort, or eavesdrop. Think about what that means in practice. Every ruler around her heard foreign envoys through a filter. She heard them raw, every hesitation, every shade of meaning, every whispered aside the envoy assumed the queen couldn't follow. And as we said earlier, one of those languages was Egyptian, making her, in Plutarch's telling, the first of her entire dynasty to learn the speech of the land they had ruled for a quarter of a millennium. Her interests didn't stop at languages. Later tradition, including fascinatingly medieval Arabic scholars writing 1,000 years after her death, remembered Cleopatra not as a seductress at all, but as a sage. Arabic writers described her as a scholar of medicine, mathematics, and alchemy, an author of scientific works, a philosopher who gathered learned men around her. One called her simply the virtuous scholar. Now, we should be honest, as we always try to be. And some of what later tradition attributed to her, medical treatises, books on cosmetics and weights and measures, was probably written by others and filed under her famous name, the way the ancient world often did. But the pattern of the memory matters. In Egypt and the East, where Roman propaganda didn't set the terms, she was remembered for her mind. That version of her survived for 1,000 years in one half of the world, while the other half remembered a woman on a couch. We might also gently note where her scientific interests reportedly wandered into darker territory. Ancient sources claim that near the end of her life, she ran experiments on poisons and venoms, determined to understand which deaths were agonizing and which were gentle. Some accounts say these tests were carried out on condemned prisoners. If true, it is a chilling detail, the scholar's method applied to the grimmest possible subject, and will simply acknowledge it and move on because it tells us something real. Her curiosity was not decorative, it was an instrument, and she pointed it at whatever she needed to master, from tax policy to the chemistry of dying. Here is the picture to hold, then, as we finally approach her coronation. Forget the couch. Picture instead a young woman in the colonnades of the museum, trading arguments with the most learned men alive, switching languages the way other people switch tone, fluent, funny, relentless, and absolutely aware that her mind was the one weapon Rome could never confiscate. The Romans would spend a century calling her a temptress. But notice what even Plutarch's famous description actually says. Her beauty, he insists, was not in itself remarkable. It was the conversation, it was the voice, it was her. Which brings us to a question you've probably been wondering about all along. What did Cleopatra actually look like? Let's deal with the most famous myth of all, Cleopatra, the most beautiful woman in history. For 2,000 years, her name has been shorthand for beauty, so overwhelming it toppled empires. The French thinker Blaise Pascal once wrote that if Cleopatra's nose had been shorter, the whole face of the earth would have changed, the idea being that history itself hinged on her looks. So, what did she actually look like? The honest answer is we only partly know, but what we do know is genuinely surprising. Start with the most reliable evidence we have, her money. Cleopatra minted coins throughout her reign, stamped with her own portrait, and coins are precious to historians because they can't be repainted by later admirers or enemies. They show us the image she approved, the face she chose to send into every marketplace in her kingdom. And the face on the coins is not a soft, doe-eyed beauty. It is strong, a prominent aquiline nose, a firm chin, sometimes jutting, a determined mouth, hair pulled back in a practical bun of braids, in the style historians call the melon coiffure, bound with the simple royal diadem, a ribbon of white cloth, the ancient badge of Greek kingship. On some coins, struck later, alongside Mark Antony, her features grow even harder, almost mirroring his, a thick neck, a hooked profile, a jaw like a general's. Some viewers see those later coins and gasp, but numismatists, the scholars who study ancient coinage, urge caution in reading them like photographs. Royal portraits on coins were propaganda too, just pointed in a different direction. When Cleopatra's face was minted to echo Antony's, the message wasn't, "This is precisely her profile." The message was, "We are partners, equals, two faces of one power." She may well have instructed the engravers to toughen her image, because the last thing a woman ruling alone in the ancient world needed was to look delicate. And that reframes the whole question, doesn't it? Even her own face was a policy decision. Then there's Plutarch, whose description we touched on earlier, and which deserves to be quoted in spirit, if not word for word. Her beauty, he wrote, was not in itself so remarkable that no one could compare with her, nor the kind that struck those who merely looked at her. But her presence, her conversation, her character, these, he said, were bewitching. The word he reaches for is about contact, not appearance. She got better the longer you knew her. Another ancient writer, Cassius Dio, disagrees and calls her brilliantly beautiful, but Dio was writing over 2 centuries later and never saw her either. The one contemporary or near contemporary thread, the thread closest to people who were actually in the room, keeps saying the same thing. It wasn't the face, it was the effect. As for the specifics our modern minds want, her exact coloring, her height, her features beyond the coins, the sources simply don't say, and we won't pretend otherwise. She was of Macedonian Greek descent. On every line of her family tree we can verify, though the identity of her mother and one grandmother remain genuinely uncertain, and scholars have debated those blank spaces for generations. What we can say is that no one who met her bothered to write down a physical description, and that silence is its own kind of evidence. The things they did write down, the voice, the wit, the languages, the nerve, were apparently more remarkable. So, where did the legend of the supreme beauty come from? Mostly from her enemies, and this is the twist worth staying awake for. Roman propaganda needed Cleopatra to be irresistible. Think about the problem from Rome's side. Two of the greatest Romans of the age, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, had allied themselves with a foreign queen. If she was their intellectual equal, a head of state they partnered with for sound strategic reasons, then Rome's heroes had simply been outnegotiated by a woman. Unthinkable. But if she was a sorceress of the senses, a beauty no mortal man could resist, then Caesar and Antony weren't outsmarted. They were bewitched. Their honor could be salvaged at the price of hers. The seductress legend, in other words, wasn't a compliment that curdled. It was an excuse, Rome's excuse, for the fact that she kept winning. Later centuries piled on their own fantasies. Renaissance painters gave her their ideal of beauty. Hollywood gave her its own. Each era repainted her face, and each face said more about the painters than about the queen. But she left us her own answer, stamped in silver if we're willing to look. A strong nose, a set jaw, steady eyes, the face of someone you would want across the table in a negotiation and dread across the table in a war. Now let's find out how that person, at 18 years old, was handed a kingdom on the edge of a cliff. In 51 BCE, Ptolemy the flute player died, in his bed, remarkably, which was not the family tradition, and his will named 2 heirs to rule together. His eldest surviving daughter, Cleopatra, about 18 years old, and her little brother, Ptolemy the 13th, who was about 10. Following dynastic custom, the sister and brother were formally married, a ceremonial arrangement between an 18-year-old and a child, binding the 2 halves of the inheritance together. We've already talked about this practice honestly, so we'll simply note it here and set it aside, because in practical terms, the marriage meant one thing: 2 courts, 2 ambitions, 1 throne. And it took perhaps a year for everyone in Alexandria to understand that Cleopatra had no intention of sharing. In the earliest documents of the reign, something remarkable happens. Her brother's name starts disappearing. Official decrees go out in her name alone. Coins are struck with her portrait alone. A queen's face on the money, no boy king in sight. In one of her first recorded acts, she traveled up the Nile to preside personally over the installation of a sacred bull at Hermonthis, one of the holiest rituals in the Egyptian religion. No Ptolemy had done such things in living memory. The message to the priests and the people was unmistakable. I am not a Greek stranger taxing you from the coast. I am your queen. It was bold, it was brilliant, and it was premature, because a 10-year-old king is never really a 10-year-old king. He is a curtain, and behind the curtain stood three men who effectively ran the palace: the eunuch Pothinus, the boy's chief minister; Achillas, commander of the army; and Theodotus, his tutor in rhetoric. Ancient writers depict them, perhaps unfairly, as a sneering pack of schemers. What's certain is that a teenage queen who issued decrees alone was a threat to everything they controlled, and they set about correcting the situation. Cleopatra's early luck turned bad, fast. The Nile flood failed. We'll talk later about what that meant, because in Egypt the flood was everything, and hungry years make every government fragile. There was trouble over Roman demands for troops, in which she was seen to yield to Rome, never a popular look in Alexandria. Piece by piece, the ministers pried her support away, and by around 49 BCE, the palace belonged to the boy and his handlers. Cleopatra, in her early 20s, fled Alexandria, first apparently to the Egyptian countryside and Upper Egypt, where her cultivation of the temples may have bought her shelter, and then out of Egypt altogether, east into Syria. Now pause here, because this is one of those moments where you learn who someone really is. She was around 21 years old. She had lost the capital, the treasury, the army, and the fleet. Her little brother's ministers had every advantage, and history is full of deposed Ptolemies who simply vanished at this point in the story. Exile for her family was usually the waiting room before the grave. Remember her sister Berenice. Cleopatra went to Syria and raised an army. We wish we knew more about how. The sources are thin, frustratingly thin, as they so often are at the moments we care about most. But somehow, a 21-year-old refugee queen, operating in a foreign land, in multiple languages, with whatever funds and loyalists she'd carried out of Egypt, assembled a force of Arab and Syrian fighters and marched it back toward her own border. By the summer of 48 BCE, her army and her brother's army sat facing each other near Pelusium, the eastern gateway fortress of Egypt at the edge of the Nile Delta. Brother against sister, both crowned, both dug in. Egypt held its breath, waiting to see which of the flute player's children would bury the other. And then, in one of history's great intrusions, somebody else's civil war came crashing through the door. Far to the north, the Roman Republic had finally torn itself in two. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. Pompey the Great had gathered the Senate's forces against him, and at Pharsalus in Greece, in August of 48 BCE, Caesar had shattered Pompey's army. Pompey, the most celebrated Roman alive, the man who had been the official guardian of the Ptolemaic children, the patron their father had bought at such crushing expense, fled the wreckage of his cause and pointed his ship toward the one royal house that owed him everything. He sailed for Egypt to call in his debts. He arrived off Pelusium, where the teenage king's camp lay, and sent word asking for refuge. The boy's ministers held a council. Theodotus, the rhetoric tutor, the ancient writers tell us, made the argument that carried the day, reasoning that helping Pompey would make an enemy of Caesar, turning him away would make enemies of both. But a dead Pompey would please Caesar and threaten no one. Dead men, he is supposed to have said, don't bite. What happened next was witnessed from the deck of Pompey's own ship by his wife. We'll say it plainly and without lingering. The great Roman was rowed ashore in a small boat by men he believed were his escorts and killed before he reached the beach. The ministers had his head preserved to present to Caesar as a gift. They believed they had just solved every problem at once. In fact, they had made the mistake that would hand Egypt to Cleopatra. 4 days after Pompey's death, Julius Caesar sailed into the harbor of Alexandria with a modest force and a conqueror's confidence, chasing his rival. The ministers of the boy king hurried to greet him, delighted with themselves, and presented their gift, Pompey's signet ring and Pompey's head. They had badly misjudged their audience. Caesar, the ancient sources tell us, turned away from the head and wept. Skeptics, ancient and modern, have wondered how much of that grief was performance. Pompey had been his enemy, but also his son-in-law once, his colleague, a Roman consul, the greatest name of the age. Perhaps the tears were real, perhaps they were politics, perhaps, as with so much in this story, both at once. What's certain is that Caesar was offended, and that an offended Caesar was the most dangerous object in the ancient world. He came ashore with his lictors and his standards, moved into the royal palace as if he owned it, and announced that, as Rome's representative and executor of the old king's will, he would personally arbitrate the dispute between the royal siblings. Both parties were summoned to appear before him. For the boy king's faction, this was awkward. For Cleopatra, it was nearly impossible. She was camped beyond Pelusium with her mercenary army. Between her and the palace lay her brother's forces, his fleet, and a capital controlled by ministers who would have been overjoyed to see her die on the road. Walking in the front gate was out of the question, and yet the entire future of her claim depended on reaching Caesar, in person, before her brother's people could poison the well. What she did next became one of the most famous entrances in world history, and it's also one of the most misremembered, so let's have some fun setting the record straight. You know the legend. Cleopatra had herself rolled up in a carpet, an oriental rug, in the movie versions, which was carried past the guards and unrolled at Caesar's feet, spilling the Queen of Egypt onto the floor like a conjuring trick. Here's what our actual source says. Plutarch, the only ancient writer who tells the story in detail, says she came by boat, slipping into the harbor at dusk in a small skiff with a single trusted companion, a Sicilian named Apollodorus. And to get through the palace unrecognized, she climbed into a stromatodesmon, a large sack or bag used for bundling up bedding and linens, which Apollodorus tied up and carried inside, right through the corridors, to Caesar's rooms. Not a carpet. A laundry-style sack of bedclothes, the ancient equivalent of being smuggled into a heavily guarded building inside a duffel bag. The carpet came along centuries later added by translators and painters, and eventually cemented by Hollywood, presumably because a queen emerging from unfurling silks makes a prettier picture than a queen climbing out of the bedding. But notice what the upgrade does. It turns a commando operation into a boudoir scene. It takes an act of desperate physical courage and repaints it as flirtation. Because think about what the real version required. She crossed a war zone and a hostile harbor at night in a rowboat. She entered a palace where the government actively wanted her dead, with no guards, no army, no exit plan, sealed in a bag, unable to see, unable to run, staking her life on the discretion of one servant and the reaction of one Roman. If a guard had opened that sack, the story of Cleopatra ends right there at 21 in a corridor. She bet everything on a single conversation, and she won the bet. Plutarch says Caesar was captivated first by the sheer audacity of the arrival, and then, as they talked, by her. And here we can finally watch her legendary skill set operate in the wild. She was perhaps 21, he was 52, the most powerful man alive, a connoisseur of intelligent company who had spent his life around Rome's sharpest minds. Whatever passed between them that night, by morning the entire situation in Egypt had inverted. The queen who yesterday had been a fugitive was now installed in the palace under Caesar's protection, and when the young king was brought in the next day, he found his sister already at the Roman's side, already restored, already ahead of him, as she would remain for the rest of his short life. The boy, the sources say, ran out into the streets, tore the diadem from his head, and screamed betrayal to the crowds. It did him no good, though it did set the city smoldering. A romance began between Caesar and Cleopatra. The sources are unanimous on that, and we needn't be coy about it. But tonight, let's resist the version of this story where the romance is the whole engine. Look at the board instead. She needed the one power on earth that could overrule her brother's ministers. He needed Egypt's treasury. He had a civil war to finish, and Egypt owed Rome a fortune. And he needed a stable, grateful government in Alexandria to supply it. Each of them was, quite precisely, the other's best available move. That it may also have been genuinely fond, even genuinely passionate, the sources suggest it was, doesn't change the geometry. With Cleopatra, the heart and the chessboard were never separate rooms. The ministers, watching their coup dissolve overnight, decided that if they couldn't out-argue Caesar, they would kill him. And so the war came to the palace itself. What followed is known as the Alexandrian War, and it very nearly killed everyone in our story before the famous parts could happen. Caesar had arrived in Egypt with a dangerously small force, a few thousand legionaries, a handful of ships, because he had been chasing a fugitive, not planning an occupation. Now he found himself besieged inside the palace quarter of a hostile city, with the queen at his side, by an Egyptian royal army of some 20,000 under Achilles, while the Alexandrian crowds, never fond of Romans on a good day, rose against him in the streets. For months, the fighting churned through one of the most beautiful urban landscapes on earth. Barricades in the colonnaded avenues, rooftop skirmishes, desperate engineering duels. At one point, the defenders pumped seawater into the palace quarters wells, and Caesar's men had to dig frantically for fresh water on the beaches. The struggle kept collapsing back to one prize, the harbor. Whoever held the harbor could be resupplied by sea. Whoever lost it would be starved out. It was during the fight for the harbor that Caesar, unable to hold the docks, ordered the Egyptian fleet burned where it lay at anchor. The fire leapt from the ships to the waterfront, and there, according to several ancient writers, it reached buildings where books were stored and scrolls burned. Later tradition inflated this into the single great catastrophe. Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. Since we're myth busting tonight, let's handle this one honestly, because the truth is more interesting than the legend. Scholars still argue about what exactly burned in 48 BCE, perhaps warehouse stocks of scrolls near the docks, perhaps some real part of the collection. The sources conflict. But we know the library as an institution was not wiped out that night, because we can see it still operating afterward. Scholars kept working in Alexandria for centuries, and later writers described the collections in later eras. The library's true death was slower and sadder than any single fire. A long decline through funding cuts, purges of scholars, civil wars, and neglect spread across hundreds of years, which is, if anything, the more sobering lesson. The greatest library on earth wasn't destroyed in a night of drama. It was allowed to fade, budget by budget, until one day it simply wasn't there. Great things are rarely murdered. More often they're abandoned. But back to our besieged palace, because inside it, the royal family was busy demonstrating everything we've learned about Ptolemaic family life. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, the last of the four siblings we haven't properly met, escaped the palace, fled to the besieging army, and had herself proclaimed queen by the troops, in direct opposition to both Cleopatra and their brother. She was somewhere in her teens, and for a few remarkable months, this teenager was effectively the leader of the war effort, even ordering the execution of the general Achilles in a command dispute. Alexandria now contained, in various states of alliance and captivity, one Roman dictator, one queen, one rival queen, and one boy king, every one of them claiming the same country. The deadlock finally broke in early 47 BCE, when Roman relief forces arrived overland from Syria and Asia Minor, including notably an army under Mithridates of Pergamon and troops sent by Judean allies. Caesar slipped out to join them, and in a battle by the Nile, the royal army was crushed. The young Ptolemy XIII fled the field, crowded onto an overloaded boat with his retreating soldiers, and the boat went down. The boy king drowned in the river his family had ruled for 3 centuries. He was about 13 years old, a child in the end, who had spent his entire short reign as the instrument of ambitious men. However, history judges the faction that used him. It's worth pausing to feel the simple sadness of that. Caesar, ever attentive to symbolism, reportedly had the river dragged until the boy's golden armor was found, so all of Egypt would know the reign was over, and no pretender could claim the king still lived. Arsinoe was taken prisoner. Her fate, sadder still, will come to in time. And Cleopatra, at 22, emerged from the rubble as the undisputed mistress of Egypt. Roman custom and Egyptian tradition alike frowned on a woman ruling utterly alone, so she was formally paired with her youngest brother, another Ptolemy, all of 12 years old, a co-ruler in name whom no one, least of all Cleopatra, mistook for an actual colleague. Take stock of her position for a moment, because the transformation is astonishing. 2 years earlier, she had been a fugitive raising mercenaries in Syria, Now her rivals were dead, exiled, or reduced to ceremonial props. The most powerful man in the world was her ally, her patron, and her partner. And Egypt, battered, singed, but intact, was hers. She was also, by that spring, expecting a child. In the spring of 47 BCE, with the war won and the city smoldering quietly behind them, Caesar and Cleopatra did something that scandalized Rome and delighted Egypt. They went on a cruise. The ancient sources describe a leisurely royal progress up the Nile aboard the state barge, and the Ptolemaic state barge was less a boat than a floating palace, a colossal double-hulled vessel, by some descriptions hundreds of feet long, with banqueting halls, shrines, gardens and pots, and colonnades of cedar and cypress rising from the water. Behind it, allegedly, trailed hundreds of supply boats and escort craft. The most powerful man in the world and the Queen of Egypt drifted south past the pyramids, already 25 centuries old, already ancient beyond imagining, past Memphis and its white walls, past temple after temple rising from the green ribbon of the floodplain. Roman writers treated the cruise as proof of decadence, their conquering hero lolling on a pleasure barge with a foreign queen while the Civil War waited. And to be fair to the gossips, it plainly was, among other things, a honeymoon in all but name. But look again with the eyes we've been training all night, and you'll see the other thing it was, a campaign tour. Egypt had just watched two royal armies tear at each other, a foreign occupier camp in the palace, and a king drown in the sacred river. The dynasty's legitimacy was bleeding, and so the new sole queen sailed the length of her kingdom, showing herself, deliberately, ceremonially, to the people who actually were Egypt, the farmers, the boatmen, the town officials, and above all the priests, the one native institution with real power. She appeared to them not as a Greek tax collector from the coast, but in the guise she would cultivate all her life, the new Isis, the goddess queen, mother, and protector of the land. And beside her, a spectacle no Egyptian had seen in centuries, and no Roman had ever seen, stood the master of Rome, visibly endorsing her reign to every crowd on every riverbank. One journey, three audiences. Egypt saw its goddess restored. The priests saw a queen who honored the old ways and was worth backing. And Rome, hearing every detail secondhand, which was perhaps the point, learned that Egypt was not an orphaned prize waiting to be annexed, but a functioning kingdom under Caesar's personal protection. Even the romance, in other words, doubled as government. With Cleopatra, it always did. Then, in midsummer of 47 BCE, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, as direct a statement as a name can be, and Alexandria promptly nicknamed him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra never showed the slightest hesitation about the boy's paternity. He was Julius Caesar's son, she said, plainly and publicly for the rest of her life. Caesar himself, characteristically, was more careful. He never formally acknowledged the child. Roman law wouldn't have recognized a foreign queen's son anyway, but he never denied him either, and those close to him would later split bitterly over what he privately believed. The question of what Caesarion was, Pharaoh's heir, Roman's son, both, neither, would hang over the rest of this story like weather. For Cleopatra, though, the political meaning was immediate and glorious. Egyptian royal theology had a slot ready made for this exact situation. The goddess Isis and her divine son Horus, the mother enthroned with the infant heir on her lap, one of the oldest and most beloved images in Egyptian religion. Temple reliefs soon showed Cleopatra as Isis nursing the young Caesarean Horus. After 3 centuries of Greek kings who barely gestured at the old faith, Egypt now had a queen who spoke the language, honored the gods, and had produced a divine heir. Whatever Alexandria's Greek elite muttered, up the Nile her stock had never been higher, and there was a colder calculation underneath, which she surely made in full. Her previous partner in rule had been a brother who went to war with her. Her current co ruler was another brother who would grow up eventually, and Ptolemaic brothers, as we've thoroughly established, did not age into harmlessness. But a son changed the arithmetic forever. A son meant that one day she could reign alongside a co ruler who owed her everything, threatened her nothing, and carried in his veins, if the world believed her, and most of it did, the blood of Caesar himself. Caesar finally tore himself away from Egypt in 47 BCE. There was still a civil war to finish, and enemies regrouping in Africa and Spain, but he left behind 3 Roman legions to secure the country. To protect Cleopatra, said her friends. To keep Egypt on a leash, said everyone else. Both were true, and both suited her. Her garrisons meant no palace coup could unseat her while her patron was away. She had the throne, the heir, the priests, the legions, and the alliance. What she wanted next was bigger. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra packed up her court, her ceremonial husband brother, and her infant son, and sailed for Rome itself. If you're settling in, well, take a slow breath with me before we cross into Rome. If this kind of history helps you unwind, a like helps this story find its way to more sleepy history lovers, and I always love reading what part surprised you most so far. Drop it in the comments whenever you get the chance. Now let your eyes rest, and let's follow Cleopatra across the sea into the heart of the city that both loved and feared her. Picture the arrival. The Queen of Egypt comes to Rome, the fabulously wealthy sovereign of the oldest kingdom on earth, sailing into the capital of the republic that had swallowed every other kingdom like hers. She came officially as a friend and ally of the Roman people, with treaties to sign. Unofficially, everyone understood. Caesar's foreign queen had come to town, and she'd brought the baby. Caesar installed her, with her boy husband brother and little Caesarion, not in some neutral guest house, but in his own garden villa across the Tiber, a sprawling estate of pavilions and groves just outside the city proper. The location was a fig leaf exactly thin enough to make the scandal worse. His wife, Calpurnia, remained in their house in the city. Rome's dinner parties talked of nothing else, and Roman high society came to visit, fascinated, appalled, and unable to stay away. In the letters of Cicero, the great orator, we get our only surviving glimpse of Cleopatra, written by someone who actually met her, and it's deliciously sour. I detest the queen, he writes to a friend, and then, in the same breath, grumbles about a broken promise involving, of all things, books. Whatever she had promised Cicero from Egypt, manuscripts, most likely treasures of the library, it was of a literary kind, he admits, suitable to his dignity. Even her enemies' complaints reveal her. She had taken the measure of Rome's vainest intellectual and offered him not gold, but books. Notice, too, what Cicero doesn't say. Rome's sharpest, cattiest pen, describing a woman later famous as the world's great seductress, says nothing about her looks. His complaint is that she was arrogant, that this foreign monarch strolling his republic behaved as if she were the equal of Roman senators. The nerve of her, walking around like a head of state, which of course she was. Then Caesar went further. In his new forum, in the gleaming temple he had built to Venus Genetrix, Venus the ancestress, divine mother of his own family line, he placed a golden statue of Cleopatra, a living foreign queen, gilded, standing in the sacred heart of Rome, beside the goddess from whom Caesar claimed descent. The implications were staggering, and Rome felt every one of them. Was she being marked as consort, as a goddess herself? Was the boy in the villa across the river being quietly slotted into the ancestry of the gods? To a certain kind of Roman, and there were many senators of that kind, the whole spectacle confirmed their darkest reading of Caesar. He had already been made dictator. Rumors swirled that he meant to be king, a word Romans hated above all others, and that the Egyptian woman was teaching him Oriental monarchy. Thrones, diadems, divine statues, dynasties. None of it was fair to her, particularly the ambitions were Caesar's own, but fairness was never the point. She was foreign, female, rich, and near the throne-shaped hole in Roman life. She made an irresistible villain, and Rome began fitting her for the costume it would never let her take off. Cleopatra stayed in Rome, with at least one return visit, into the spring of 44 BCE, which means she was almost certainly in the city, in the villa across the river, on the 15th of March. She may have heard the roar from the streets before any messenger reached her. At a meeting of the Senate that morning, at the foot of Pompey's statue, a group of senators, men who called themselves liberators, surrounded Julius Caesar and stabbed him to death. The master of the world, her protector, her ally, her lover, the father of her son, was gone in a matter of moments. Take a slow breath and stand where she stood. She was 30 years old, in a foreign city that despised her, holding a 3-year-old whom half of Rome saw as a threat and the other half as a bargaining chip. Every guarantee she possessed, her treaty, her throne's security, the legions in Egypt, her son's future, had rested on one man's heartbeat, and that heartbeat had just stopped. The city around her was sliding toward chaos. Mobs were burning. The assassins held the capital. Nobody knew who ruled Rome, or whether anyone did. And then came the reading of Caesar's will, and its silence. The will named as heir not Caesarion, who could never have inherited under Roman law anyway, but Caesar's Roman great-nephew, a slight, cold-eyed, chronically unwell 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius. Octavian, as history calls him. Remember the name, because for the rest of this story, he is the other player at the table. From the moment that will was read, Octavian's entire claim to power rested on being Caesar's son and heir, which made the existence of an actual son of Caesar's body, wearing a crown in Egypt, a problem that could only end one way. Cleopatra did not linger to watch Rome burn. Within weeks, she gathered her household and sailed for Alexandria, and somewhere on that voyage, or soon after, her young brother and ceremonial co-ruler Ptolemy XIV died. Ancient writers state flatly that she had him poisoned, We have no proof, and historians note the sources are hostile, but no one, then or now, has struggled to see the logic. Within months, she had elevated 3-year-old Caesarion to the throne beside her instead, Ptolemy the 15th Caesar, co ruler of Egypt. Her son was now her king. Her rivals were gone, and in Rome, the wolves had begun to circle one another. All she could do was what Egypt had always done best: wait and grow rich and watch the river. Let's step off the grand stage of Roman politics for a while, lower the volume, and ask the question this channel loves best. What was she actually like as a ruler? Not the legend, the administrator. Because the years after Caesar's death, roughly 44 to 41 BCE, are when we see Cleopatra doing the unglamorous work of running a country through hard times, and it may be the most quietly impressive stretch of her life. First, understand the machine she was operating. Ptolemaic Egypt was the most centralized economy in the ancient world, a bureaucratic marvel that would look almost modern to us. In principle, the crown owned or controlled nearly everything: royal farmland leased to peasant cultivators, state monopolies on essentials like lamp oil, papyrus, salt, and beer, licensed banks, customs houses on every trade route, and a paper trail, a papyrus trail that recorded harvests, taxes, and inventories village by village. At the head of this immense pyramid of scribes and inspectors sat one person. Every thread ran upward to the queen. Some rulers inherited such machines and let ministers run them. The evidence suggests Cleopatra ran hers hands on and shrewdly. Take the currency. Egypt under Cleopatra operated a closed monetary system. Foreign merchants had to exchange their silver at the border for Egyptian coin, at rates the crown set, with the crown taking its cut on every exchange. She continued and sharpened her father's practice of debasing the coinage, reducing the actual silver content while commanding by royal decree that the coins keep their face value. She also issued bronze coinage stamped with denominations, an early step toward money worth what the state says it's worth, rather than what the metal weighs. Economists looking back see something startlingly sophisticated: a ruler using currency policy to stretch state resources through a crisis. Her subjects saw coins that still bought bread. Her treasury saw the difference, and she needed every bit of that cleverness because nature turned against her almost immediately. Everything in Egypt depended on the Nile flood, that annual miracle when the river rose and spread life across the fields. In the mid 40s BCE, the flood failed and then failed again. Ancient sources and climate science actually converge here in a way that gives historians chills. Ice cores and geological records point to a massive volcanic eruption in 44 BCE, far away, but vast enough to veil the atmosphere and disrupt the monsoon rains that feed the Nile. The skies over the whole Mediterranean dimmed strangely in the year of Caesar's death. Romans read it as an omen for him. In Egypt, it meant the river simply did not rise. Fields lay dry. The granaries emptied. Famine crept up the delta, and with it came plague. This is the kind of moment that breaks regimes. Remember, a failed flood helped topple Cleopatra herself back in 49. So watch what she did this time. A surviving decree from these years, one of the precious scraps of her actual government that survive on papyrus and stone, shows grain from the countryside being directed under royal control to keep Alexandria fed, the volatile capital that made and unmade monarchs. Ancient testimony records that she opened the royal granaries in the crisis. One inscription from this period, set up by a local official, praises the crown's protection of the people in terms warmer than boilerplate usually gets. Hostile as our sources are, no rebellion shook Egypt in those hungry years. Sit with that. A young queen, a dead patron, a failed river, plague in the towns, and the country held. Kingdoms with far fewer problems fell apart constantly in the ancient world. Hers didn't. We even have, possibly, her handwriting. On a papyrus document from 33 BCE's granting sweeping tax exemptions to an important Roman, a second hand has added one Greek word at the bottom, where a modern executive would sign, genisto, make it happen. Some scholars believe that word was written by Cleopatra herself. We can't be certain. Queens had secretaries, and scholars debate it. But whether or not the ink is hers, the document is. This is what her power actually looked like day to day. Not banquets, paperwork, a stack of petitions and decrees, decisions about taxes and grain and exemptions, and at the bottom of each, one word from the top of the pyramid: make it happen. Notice also who the tax break was for. A powerful Roman she needed on her side. Her economic policy and her foreign policy were the same policy. Egypt's wealth was her army. She spent it the way generals spend soldiers, precisely where it would matter. So here's the corrective picture to set against every painting of a queen on a couch. Cleopatra at a work table mid-crisis. Reports from the Nome officials on one side, treasury figures on the other. An envoy waiting. She'll take the meeting without an interpreter. A decision about the coinage, a decision about the granaries, a petition from a temple, a letter to Rome requiring exactly the right shade of flattery. That was the job, and every scrap of surviving evidence says she was good at it. Rome called her the Queen of Pleasure. Her paperwork says workaholic. But Rome, meanwhile, had sorted its chaos into two great camps, and one of their leaders was about to summon her to a meeting that would decide the rest of her life. By 41 BCE, Rome's endless civil wars had produced a new arrangement at the top, a second triumvirate, three men sharing power after avenging Caesar's murder at the Battle of Philippi. Octavian, Caesar's cold young heir, held the West. A lesser figure, Lepidus, held a shrinking slice of Africa. And the East, the richest, oldest, most complicated third of the Roman world, fell to the general who had done most of the fighting at Philippi, Mark Antony. We met Antony briefly already as a young cavalry officer glimpsing a teenage princess in Alexandria years before. He was now in his early 40s, at the peak of his fame, a genuinely gifted soldier, famously convivial, magnetic with his troops, and by every account, no one's idea of a subtle diplomat. Touring his new eastern territories to raise money for the wars still ahead, he summoned the various client kings and queens of the region to account for themselves, and among the summons sent out was one to the Queen of Egypt, ordering her to explain herself at the city of Tarsus in what's now southern Turkey. Egypt's neutrality during the recent wars had been at best ambiguous, and Antony wanted answers and money. A summons like this was, in the etiquette of the time, a small humiliation, a great monarch made to travel and explain herself to a Roman general. Cleopatra had received orders like it before from lesser men, and she understood exactly how to answer one. She did not arrive early, apologetic, and plainly dressed to plead her case. She kept Antony waiting. The ancient sources are explicit about this, and when she finally came, she came up the river Cydnus in a fashion the whole province would be talking about for a generation. Plutarch's description, drawing on an eyewitness account, is the source behind nearly every dramatic staging of Cleopatra ever made, and it earns its reputation. The stern of her barge, he writes, was gilded, its sails dyed purple, and it was rowed by silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes and lyres. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy woven with gold, dressed as Venus is dressed in paintings, while boys costumed as Cupids stood fanning her, and her loveliest attendants, arrayed as sea nymphs and graces, worked the rudder and the ropes. Perfumed incense drifted from the ship across the river banks, and the townspeople of Tarsus abandoned Antony's own tribunal in the marketplace to run down and gawk at the water until the general found himself, absurdly, presiding over an empty square. It is by any measure one of the great entrances in history. But before we let it collapse into pure spectacle, notice what it actually was: a message composed entirely in images, aimed at a Roman audience that would understand every reference. Venus, divine ancestress of Antony's own political faction, the very goddess Caesar had enshrined her beside in Rome. This wasn't an outsider dazzling a general with exotic riches, though it was certainly that too. It was Egypt's queen speaking to Rome in Rome's own mythological language, casting herself not as a subject arriving to be judged, but as a goddess arriving to be courted. She turned Antony's summons inside out before he said a word. Antony, we're told, sent an invitation to dinner. Cleopatra sent one back, inviting him instead, a small but pointed reversal of who was hosting whom, and the banquet that followed reportedly stunned even a Roman general accustomed to plunder, with a hall lit by chandeliers of hanging lamps arranged, Plutarch says, into geometric patterns and circles of startling beauty. Whatever combination of romance, calculation, mutual amusement, and mutual advantage passed between them at Tarsus, and it was very likely all four, the political outcome arrived quickly. Antony did not punish Egypt for its ambiguous wartime conduct. Quite the opposite. Within the year, at Cleopatra's urging, he had her sister Arsinoe, the teenage rival queen from the Alexandrian siege, who had lived out the intervening years as a defeated exile under Roman guard in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, dragged from the sanctuary steps and executed. It is the darkest single act of Cleopatra's life that we can trace directly to her wishes, and we won't dress it up. This was the last of her siblings, killed to close off the last plausible alternative to her own rule. The dynasty that had shaped her, kill the rival, keep the throne, closed its circle through her hands one final time. Antony then followed her back to Alexandria and spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE at her court, a season the sources remember as one long, extravagant party, which brings us to some of the most entertaining stories about her that have survived from antiquity, and which we'll get to shortly because they deserve their own telling. But hold the strategic picture steady underneath the spectacle, because it's the same picture we keep finding whenever we look closely at this woman. She had just secured, through a single unforgettable afternoon on a river, an alliance with the master of the Roman East, the elimination of her last dynastic rival, and, best of all, for a queen who had learned as a teenager exactly how quickly Roman patronage could vanish, a second powerful Roman standing beside her at the very moment the first one's death had left her exposed. She had done it again. Just as she'd once turned a war zone smuggling operation into an alliance with Caesar, she'd turned a humiliating summons into a partnership with Antony. Twice now, Rome had sent its finest to bring Egypt to heel, and twice, Egypt's queen had brought the general home with her instead. Every long, serious biography needs a little room to breathe, so let's spend a few minutes on the stories that made Cleopatra and Antony's Alexandrian winter famous. Some almost certainly true, some almost certainly not, and all of them revealing in their own way. Antony and Cleopatra, that winter of 41 to 40 BCE, founded a dining club. They gave it a name that history has never let go of, the Amimetobioi, the inimitable livers, roughly the club of those whose way of life could never be equaled. Membership seems to have consisted of the two of them and their inner circle of friends, and its entire purpose, as far as we can tell, was staging the most spectacular banquets the ancient world had ever seen on a nightly rotating basis, each host trying to outdo the last. Plutarch preserves a story from a source close to the events, a doctor named Philetus, who as a young man knew one of the palace cooks, about the kitchens preparing for one of these dinners. Philetus, curious, wandered in and was startled to see 8 wild boars roasting at once, for what he assumed must be an enormous banquet. The cook set him straight. The guest list was actually quite small, perhaps a dozen people, but Antony liked his meat served precisely at its peak the moment he called for dinner, and no one could predict exactly when that moment would come. He might want it now, or an hour from now, deep in conversation or a game of dice. So the kitchen staggered 8 boars at 8 different stages of roasting, ready to pull whichever one happened to be perfect the instant the order came. It's a wonderful, human-scaled detail, less about decadence for its own sake, and more about the logistics of pleasing an unpredictable, powerful man, which is a problem every palace kitchen in history has had to solve. Then there's the story everyone knows, the one about the pearl, and it's worth telling precisely because it shows how legends like hers get built. The tale, recorded by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder more than a century later, goes like this. Antony boasted that he could spend an impossible fortune on a single dinner. Cleopatra wagered she could spend more on one meal than any feast in history, and won the bet with a party trick. She removed one of a pair of famously enormous pearl earrings, dissolved it in a cup of vinegar, and drank it down, the pearl alone supposedly worth a fortune equivalent to the tax revenue of a small kingdom. It's a fantastic story. It is also, chemically and historically, almost certainly untrue, or at least wildly exaggerated. Pearls are made of calcium carbonate, and ordinary vinegar dissolves it far too slowly to make for good theater. You'd need a strong acid and considerable time, not a dramatic gulp at a dinner table. Pliny himself was writing more than 100 years after the supposed event, collecting popular tales rather than eyewitness reports, in a book explicitly about the excesses of luxury. He needed a symbol of extravagant female spending, and Cleopatra was by then the most famous target available. We tell you this not to spoil a good story, but because it's the perfect little case study for everything we've been unpacking tonight. A story gets told about Cleopatra. It's vivid, it's a little scandalous, it confirms exactly what the audience already expects from a foreign queen, and a century later, nobody checks the chemistry. That's how a legend gets built, one plausible sounding exaggeration at a time, until the exaggeration is more famous than the woman. What's likely true underneath the Pearl story is something more modest and honestly more impressive. That winter in Alexandria really was staggeringly lavish, that Cleopatra really did understand the theater of wealth as a form of political messaging. Remember the barge at Tarsus? And that she and Antony really did throw themselves into a season of games, hunting, drinking, and practical jokes with the appetite of two people who'd both spent years fighting for their lives and had, for one winter, nothing left to prove. One more story, gentler than the rest, and probably closer to the truth of who they actually were to each other. Plutarch tells us that the pair liked to wander Alexandria's streets in disguise, dressed as ordinary servants or commoners, knocking on strangers' doors for the fun of it, teasing shopkeepers, getting into good natured scrapes with the locals, who Plutarch notes dryly, generally figured out who they really were and played along. Antony apparently loved fishing, and once, embarrassed by a poor catch in front of Cleopatra, secretly had a diver attach an already caught fish to his hook underwater. She noticed the trick, said nothing, and the next day arranged for one of her own men to beat him to it, attaching a salted, previously cured fish to his line instead, so that when he triumphantly reeled it in, the whole court dissolved in laughter at the general's very unfresh catch. It's a small, warm story, and it's worth holding on to amid everything grander. Two of the most powerful people in the world, teasing each other on a fishing trip. Whatever else this relationship was, alliance, strategy, spectacle, the sources agree, again and again, that at its best it also seems to have simply been fun. Genuine, mutual, unguarded fun between two people who spent most of their lives having to be careful. That winter didn't last. Antony had a wife back in Rome, a war to finish in the east, and a fragile triumvirate to hold together. In the spring, he sailed away, leaving Cleopatra pregnant with twins, and leaving Rome's already sharpening rumors about the Eastern general and his Egyptian queen with a great deal more to talk about. The years that followed Antony's departure from around 40 to 37 BCE were some of the strangest of Cleopatra's life, years spent almost entirely apart from the man history bound her to, running her kingdom, raising her children, and watching Roman politics lurch through one crisis after another from a careful distance. She gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. The names were not sentimental. They reached backward into Ptolemaic and Egyptian solar theology and forward into an implicit claim, children of Antony and Cleopatra, marked from birth as rulers of a restored golden age, spanning both halves of the old Alexandrian Empire. Even her babies' names were foreign policy. Meanwhile, Antony, back in the wider Roman world, made choices that tangled the story further. To patch over a rupture with Octavian, the two triumvirs struck a peace sealed in classic Roman fashion with a marriage. Antony wed Octavian's own sister, a genuinely capable and well regarded Roman noblewoman named Octavia. For several years, Antony maintained both households in some fashion, a Roman wife in Athens and Rome, an Egyptian queen and their children in Alexandria, an arrangement that satisfied no one and that Octavian would mine for propaganda for the rest of the decade. By 37 BCE, the political marriage had served its purpose and begun to fray, and Antony turned his full attention to a project he'd been circling for years, a great Roman invasion of Parthia, the vast empire east of Syria that had humiliated Rome a generation earlier by annihilating an entire army under the general Crassus. Conquering Parthia would make Antony the equal of Alexander himself. It would also require staggering amounts of money, supplies, and a secure base of operations. And there was exactly one place in the Roman world positioned to provide all three. Antony summoned Cleopatra to Antioch in Syria, and this time there was no ambiguity about what he needed. In exchange for funding and provisioning his Parthian campaign, he granted her something extraordinary, substantial new territories, restoring to Ptolemaic Egypt lands that earlier kings of her line had lost over generations. Stretches of the Levantine coast, parts of Cilicia, the rich balsam groves around Jericho, even a slice of Nabatean Arabia. It was the largest expansion of Ptolemaic Egypt in over a century, achieved not by war, but by partnership. Whatever else this relationship was, it kept making Egypt bigger. It was around this time, most historians believe, that Antony and Cleopatra also formalized their union by an Egyptian ceremony, not a marriage Rome would ever recognize, since Antony remained legally married to Octavia under Roman law, but real enough by the customs of Alexandria, and real enough evidently to both of them. A third child followed in the coming years, a boy named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony's Parthian invasion, launched in 36 BCE with Cleopatra's resources behind it, went badly. A long, grinding retreat through brutal terrain that cost him a large fraction of his army, redeemed from total catastrophe only by his own skill at managing the withdrawal. He returned to Syria diminished, and it was Cleopatra who met him with fresh supplies, money, and clothing for his battered legions. In the accounting of their partnership, she had now bailed him out militarily as well as financially, a debt that would matter later when his judgment was questioned. Then, in 34 BCE, came the moment that Octavian's propaganda machine had been waiting for, the gift that made every accusation he wanted to level suddenly right itself. The ceremony historians call the Donations of Alexandria. In a grand public spectacle in the city, Antony and Cleopatra presided over a formal distribution of titles and territories to their children. Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings, and pointedly, the true son and heir of the deified Julius Caesar, a direct public challenge to Octavian's entire claim to legitimacy, since Octavian's power rested on being Caesar's adopted heir, and here was Caesar's actual blood son being crowned in front of the world. Cleopatra herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings. The twins and young Ptolemy Philadelphus were granted grand titles over swaths of the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, some of the territory more aspirational than actual. and Cleopatra presided over the ceremony, dressed once again as the goddess Isis. To Alexandria, to the Greek East, this was theater any Hellenistic audience would recognize instantly, the standard language of dynastic ambition, no stranger than any Ptolemy or Seleucid king had used for centuries. But a full transcript of it, translated into blunt Latin and read aloud in the Roman Forum, was devastating. Antony, a Roman triumvir, appeared to be handing away Roman provinces and Roman legitimacy to a foreign queen's children, one of whom was being called the true heir of the deified Caesar, a title Octavian regarded as his alone. Octavian had been building his case against Antony for years, patiently, piece by piece. The donations of Alexandria handed him the final piece, gift wrapped. Before we follow this story to its battlefield, we need to stop and look closely at what was happening in Rome itself, because this chapter is the real origin of the Cleopatra you thought you knew walking into tonight's video, and understanding it is the whole point of everything we've been building toward. Octavian faced a genuine political problem in the years leading up to 32 BCE. He could not simply declare war on Mark Antony. Antony was a Roman citizen, a fellow triumvir, a legitimate power in the state, and a civil war between two Roman leaders was exactly the kind of naked power grab the Roman public had grown to despise after a century of them. Octavian needed something else, a war that felt defensive, patriotic, almost holy. He needed a foreign enemy. Cleopatra was, for his purposes, perfect. She was foreign. She was fabulously wealthy in a way that fed old Roman anxieties about Eastern luxury corrupting Roman virtue. She was a woman wielding real political power, which struck deep chords of unease in a deeply patriarchal society that officially barred women from public office. And she was, undeniably, entangled with Antony's decisions in ways that could be reframed with a bit of rhetorical pressure as control. So Octavian built his casus belli entirely around her. He had the Senate strips and Antony of his powers, but crucially, he did not have Rome declare war on Antony. He had Rome declare war on Cleopatra alone, a war officially against a foreign queen, not against a Roman citizen who happened to be standing beside her. It was a legal fiction, and everyone half knew it, but it worked because it let Romans who admired Antony frame the coming conflict as a rescue mission rather than a civil war. Rome saving her greatest son from a witch's spell. And the poets and propagandists went to work. We should say clearly, the writers who produced the most vivid, damning images of Cleopatra that survive from antiquity were not neutral historians. They were Augustan-era poets, writing under the patronage of the man who had just defeated her in the years immediately after her death, when praising the winner and damning the loser was not just fashionable, but professionally wise. The poet Horace, upon news of her death, wrote an ode calling her a fatal monstrum, a deadly, monstrous omen, while also, to be fair to him, grudgingly admiring the courage of her final choice, which we'll come to shortly. Propertius painted her as a wanton Eastern queen who had dared to dream of ruling Rome itself, threatening to yoke the capital to Egyptian gods. Virgil, in the Aeneid, composed under Augustus's own patronage no less, placed a symbolic image of the Battle of Actium at the very center of Aeneas's shield, and on it Cleopatra rallies monstrous animal-headed Egyptian gods against Rome's noble deities, an image designed to make the coming war look like a battle between civilization and barbarism itself. None of it, notice, was really about her. It was about Antony, and about Octavian's need to explain why decent Romans had followed a man now being cast as a traitor. If Antony was simply weak, foolish, or drunk on Eastern excess, that was a character flaw the Roman public might forgive with time. But if he had been enchanted, drugged, bewitched, sexually enslaved by a foreign sorceress queen, then his fall was not his fault at all. It was hers. The propaganda didn't just attack Cleopatra, it used her to rescue Antony's reputation from full responsibility for his own choices by making her the villain of a story where he was merely the victim. This is the machine that manufactured the Cleopatra of legend, the temptress, the schemer, the woman whose bed was a battlefield more dangerous than any in Parthia. It worked so completely and for so long that 2,000 years later, the propaganda is still what most people picture first when they hear her name, while the queen who spoke 9 languages ran a sophisticated grain policy through famine and outmaneuvered Roman generals twice her age has to be rediscovered, video by video, fact by patient fact. We are tonight part of that slow rediscovery. It has taken 2 millennia to start giving her back her mind. Octavian's war against the Egyptian woman, as Roman propaganda always called her, rarely even by name, moved from poetry to open conflict in 32 BCE. Antony, in a final break with Rome, formally divorced Octavia. Both sides began mustering fleets, and in the autumn of 31 BCE, the two great forces of the Mediterranean world converged off a headland on the western coast of Greece at a place called Actium. The Battle of Actium has come down to us wrapped in one of the most persistent legends of the whole story, that Cleopatra, gripped by sudden panic in the middle of the fighting, turned her ships and fled the battle, and that Antony, besotted, abandoned his own fleet and his men to chase after her, the great general throwing away an empire for love. It is a wonderfully dramatic image. It is also, when you look at the actual military situation, almost certainly the propaganda talking again, and worth taking apart carefully, because the real story is more interesting and considerably less humiliating to everyone involved. Start with the forces on each side. Antony and Cleopatra together commanded a substantial fleet, a large army, and Egypt's treasury behind them. Octavian's brilliant admiral, Marcus Agrippa, commanded lighter, faster, more maneuverable ships, and crucially, had spent months harassing Antony's supply lines and blockading his position on the Greek coast. By the time the fleets actually engaged in September of 31 BCE, Antony's forces were already weakened by disease, dwindling supplies, and desertions. Some ancient accounts even suggest that Antony's own camp was divided over strategy, with some officers urging him to abandon the fleet entirely and fight on land, where his legions held the advantage. The battle itself was, by most careful modern reconstructions, not the heroic naval clash of legend, but something more like a fleet trying to break out of a blockade. Cleopatra's own squadron, 60 ships according to Plutarch, including the treasury, held a position toward the rear, which was not unusual for a fleet's paymaster and would also make sense as a rearguard positioned for exactly the maneuver that followed. At a certain point in the engagement, her squadron hoisted sail and drove directly through a gap in the fighting, out to open sea, escaping the blockade. Was this cowardice, panic that seized her mid battle, as Roman poets loved to claim? Or was it always the plan, the treasury fleet positioned to break for open water the moment the main battle bogged down, preserving Egypt's ships, Egypt's gold, and Egypt's queen, rather than risking everything on one contested afternoon? We genuinely cannot be certain. The ancient accounts are contradictory, and as we've spent this whole video establishing, deeply hostile. But notice which explanation fits the woman we've been getting to know all night. The strategist who smuggled herself past an army in a sack, who built a currency policy to survive a famine, who kept a spare escape route in reserve at every crisis of her life. A queen who had watched Rome's factions rise and fall for 2 decades was unlikely to bet the entire Ptolemaic treasury and her own life on a single naval engagement she had good reason to think was going badly. What we know for certain is what Antony did next. He left his flagship, boarded a smaller vessel, and followed her out through the gap, leaving the bulk of his fleet and his army behind. Whatever calculation was in his mind, and Roman writers, needing him to look weak rather than treacherous, insist it was love scrambling his judgment. The practical result was catastrophic for his own men. His abandoned fleet fought on for a time and then began surrendering. His land army, hearing the fleet was lost and its commander gone, negotiated its own surrender to Octavian within days rather than die for a general who had sailed away. It is worth pausing on the men left on that Greek coast, because history rarely does. Tens of thousands of soldiers who had marched and starved and bled for Antony's cause discovered in the space of an afternoon that their commander had left the battlefield without them. Whatever Cleopatra's escape was, panic, plan, or something of both, its cost was paid by people who never got a vote in the decision. That's worth remembering before we let the romance of the story sweep us past it. Antony's flagship caught up with Cleopatra's squadron at sea. Plutarch reports that for 3 days he sat alone at the prow of his ship, speaking to no one, a defeated man absorbing in silence exactly what he had just lost. When he finally rejoined her, the two sailed on together toward Egypt, the fleet gone, the army lost, the alliance of client kings that had backed them beginning to peel away and make separate peace with the obvious victor. Actium did not end the war outright. Alexandria itself would hold for another year, but it ended any real hope of winning it. Rome's east had chosen its master, and it was not going to be Antony, and it was not going to be Cleopatra. From this point forward, the story of these two extraordinary people is the story of a slow, dignified retreat toward an ending they could both see coming from a long way off. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria in the autumn of 31 BCE, and what followed was not surrender, but one more season of the same restless resourcefulness that had carried her through every crisis of her life. She still had a treasury, still had a fleet, still had a kingdom, however diminished. Ancient sources describe schemes from these final months that sound almost desperate in their scope. A plan to drag her remaining ships overland from the Mediterranean coast across to the Red Sea, escaping the whole Roman Mediterranean entirely, and sailing her family and her wealth east, out of Octavian's reach, perhaps to India, perhaps simply to somewhere Rome's arm couldn't yet follow. The ships were reportedly burned by hostile Arab forces before the plan could be completed. It's a haunting detail. A queen who had spent her whole life turning the map to her advantage, still searching for one more door, right up until the walls closed in. Through the winter, envoys went back and forth between Alexandria and Octavian's approaching forces. Cleopatra, ever the negotiator, seems to have tried what had worked before, offering treasure, offering abdication in favor of her children, testing whether this Roman, like the two before him, could be reasoned with, bargained with, perhaps even charmed. Octavian, unlike Caesar and unlike Antony, gave nothing away. He wanted Egypt's treasury intact, and it seems he wanted Cleopatra herself alive and unharmed for a very specific purpose we'll come to. Beyond that, he offered no real terms. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces had reached the outskirts of Alexandria itself. There was a final engagement outside the city, which Antony's remaining forces lost, and after it, in circumstances the sources describe with real confusion, Antony received word, false word, that Cleopatra had died. What happened next is one of the saddest passages in ancient biography, and we'll walk through it gently, the way we always handle loss on this channel, without dwelling on detail that doesn't serve the memory of who these people were. Believing Cleopatra gone and his own cause utterly lost, Antony chose to end his own life by his own sword, in the old Roman manner reserved for a defeated general who would not be paraded in a conqueror's triumph. He did not die instantly. According to Plutarch, word reached him in his final hours that Cleopatra was, in fact, alive, and he asked to be carried to her. She had barricaded herself inside a monument or mausoleum she had built near the palace, intended originally as her own tomb, stocked with Egypt's remaining treasure, jewels, gold, ebony, ivory, even flammable materials she reportedly threatened to burn rather than let Octavian parade it through Rome. When Antony was brought to the sealed building, Cleopatra and her two remaining attendants apparently had to haul him up to a window with ropes, unable to open the barricaded doors even for this. He died in her arms, in her own tomb, and Plutarch tells us that grief for him in that moment briefly overtook every calculation she had made her whole life. Octavian entered Alexandria shortly after and took Cleopatra into custody, respectfully by most accounts, and with real caution, because he understood exactly what she still meant to the people of Egypt and did not want a public death or a martyrdom on his hands, not yet. What he wanted, ancient writers agree, was Cleopatra alive and visibly defeated, in chains, walked through the streets of Rome in his triumph, the ultimate proof for a Roman public that had never quite believed Caesar or Antony could really have been outmatched by a woman, that this dangerous queen had finally, truly been conquered. Cleopatra, we're told, understood this plan and could not accept it. What dignity remained to her as the last pharaoh of Egypt, as Isis incarnate to millions of her people, as a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated by Rome and outmaneuvering it anyway, could not survive that walk through a Roman street in chains as a curiosity for a crowd to gawk at. On the 12th of August, in 30 BCE, having arranged one final meal and one final letter to Octavian requesting burial beside Antony, Cleopatra died in her chambers, along with her two loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian. The famous story, that she brought about her own death by way of an asp, a small poisonous snake smuggled in among a basket of figs, is the version that has survived in popular memory ever since, immortalized centuries later by Shakespeare. It may well be true. It was reported quite soon after her death by writers with access to people who had been there. But even ancient authors closest to the events admitted uncertainty about the exact method, and no mark was ever conclusively found on her body by the physicians Octavian sent. What is certain across every version is only this: it was her own choice, made with the same clear eyed nerve that had carried her through every crisis of her life, and made specifically to deny Octavian the victory he wanted most. She was 39 years old. Octavian, arriving too late to stop her, is said to have been genuinely struck by what he found, and by more than one ancient account, quietly, grudgingly impressed by the manner of her death, even as it cost him the triumph he had planned. He allowed her final wish. She was buried beside Antony, as she had asked, and the tomb has never been found. Egypt became a Roman province the moment Cleopatra died, not a province governed like the others, in fact, but Octavian's own personal possession, too valuable and too strategically vital to be entrusted to the ordinary machinery of the Senate. The kingdom the Ptolemies had ruled for 275 years, the last independent successor state of Alexander's shattered empire, simply ceased to exist as a kingdom at all. In its place, a Roman breadbasket, feeding the city that had spent decades fearing and desiring it in equal measure. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, then about 17 years old, had been sent east by his mother in the war's final weeks, perhaps toward India, along a similar fleeing the net logic to the burned Red Sea ships. One more attempt at one more door. He was betrayed, brought back, and executed on Octavian's order. The reasoning attributed to Octavian's advisors has survived in a chillingly quotable line: too many Caesars is not a good thing. As long as an actual son of Julius Caesar breathed, Octavian's own adopted claim to the name carried an asterisk. Caesarion's death erased it. The three younger children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared and taken to Rome. It is one of the stranger footnotes of this whole saga that they were raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the woman his marriage to Cleopatra had always publicly overshadowed. We don't know how that household felt from the inside, and we won't invent an emotional life for children history barely documented. What we do know is what happened to the daughter, Cleopatra Selene, the moon. She was married off as an act of Roman policy to Juba II, a Romanized North African prince, and the two of them went on to jointly rule the client kingdom of Mauritania. She named her own son Ptolemy. Somewhere in what is now Algeria and Morocco, in a court that blended Roman, African, and Greek culture, the granddaughter of the last pharaoh sat on a throne of her own, carrying her mother's memory into a new generation, in a new land, under a new name. It is the one thread of this story with something like a hopeful ending. Octavian, soon renamed Augustus, built the rest of his 50-year reign and the entire imperial system that followed it, partly on the foundation of having saved Rome from Cleopatra. The date of her defeat became, functionally, the founding date of the Roman Empire's peace. Every poet who had once served Antony pivoted gracefully to celebrating Augustus, and their verses about the monstrous Eastern queen who nearly brought Rome to its knees became for 2,000 years the closest thing most of the world had to a primary source. That's really the last myth bust we need to leave you with tonight, because it's the one that contains all the others. We started this evening with a woman in your mind, heavy eyeliner, a couch, a snake, an empire lost for love. We're ending it, I hope, with someone else entirely. A girl raised beside the greatest library on earth, fluent in 9 languages before she was old enough to rule anything. A teenager who lost a war and rebuilt an army in exile rather than accept a quiet exit. A young queen who kept her country fed through failed floods and plague and signed her own decrees, make it happen, at the bottom of a stack of unglamorous paperwork. A diplomat clever enough to turn two of the most powerful men in the ancient world into partners rather than conquerors, not once but twice. And at the very end, a woman who chose the manner of her own death rather than let her defeat become a Roman parade. None of that makes her simple, and we haven't tried to pretend it does. She killed to keep her throne because the only rule book her family ever gave her said that was how thrones were kept. She was, by any honest reckoning, as ruthless as she was brilliant, and the two were never really separate things in her. The ruthlessness was very often the brilliance, aimed at survival. We don't think you need a flattened saint to find someone remarkable. The real Cleopatra, contradictions and all, is more interesting than the legend by a wide margin. She lost, in the end, to Rome, as almost everyone eventually did. But look at what Rome had to build to beat her memory. An entire propaganda machine, deployed by the future first emperor himself, dedicated to convincing the world that the last pharaoh of Egypt was nothing more than a pretty, dangerous distraction. That's not the kind of effort you spend on someone unremarkable. Empires don't need poetry to bury the harmless. They only need it for the ones who were genuinely, lastingly dangerous to underestimate. 2,000 years later, here we are, still talking about her, still trying to see past the mask Rome built. I think, on balance, she'd count that as a win. If you're still with us, thank you for spending these quiet hours with a queen who deserved a longer, gentler memory than the one she was given. Wherever you are tonight, I hope her story has settled somewhere soft in your mind, the way the Nile once settled over her fields every year, patient and renewing. Let the palace lights of Alexandria dim now. Let the harbor go quiet. Let the lighthouse burn low on the horizon, and let yourself drift, slowly, into sleep. Rest easy. Sleep well. This is Drowsy History.